for once, we're actually live on my channel. That's sort of a new thing, but whatever. Just jumping right into it. It's Nick and Malik here talking about this whole ridiculous kind of mess that we've got ourselves in regarding Spider-Man's presence in the MCU. And before, I don't know if you also want to do this, just sort of laying out your stance before we get into like the details of anything. I want to like make two things really clear from where I'm standing right now. One of which is I see a lot of people dogpiling on Sony for what's been going on. I am personally operating from the belief that this is 100% Disney's fault, and we will get into reasons why. But if you have to pick a bad guy in this situation, and I'm not necessarily saying that you must, that's the stance that I'm taking. Secondly, and I know that I might possibly be in the minority when I say this, I'm going to be coming into this discussion under the assumption that this will eventually get fixed like relatively soon. I'm maybe that's naive, maybe that's overly optimistic, but right now I'm viewing this whole situation with the mind that this whole thing is going to be amended or fixed in such a time that we'll hardly get to see any long-term consequences of it. Like, I fully believe that by the time this whole thing blows over and Sony and Disney realize they're being dumb, we will get the third Tom Holland movie in the MCU roughly around the time we would have gotten it anyway.
All right.
So I don't know if do you want to lay out exactly what's happened here, or should I?
Um,
And do you agree with me
well,
on that for a start?
for the most part, yeah, I do. I'd say I'm like 70-30 on it. I think there's a solid 70% chance that this gets rectified probably before the end of the year.
Yeah, I say within a year at most, because like some people, the people who do agree with me, have been drawing comparisons to like the James Gunn situation, which granted is a very, very, very different situation, but we can maybe talk about sort of how they're similar, whatever. But that got fixed like within almost almost exactly a year of it having happened. So I think this is going. This I think is a much smaller scale. I don't know. We'll talk about it, but I do think within the year we're gonna see this not be an issue anymore, and everyone who's acting like it's the definitive end of like Spider-Man's presence in the MCU right now is gonna look back and think that it's kind of overreacting. I think.
Yeah, well, you can go ahead and lay out the big story.
Okay, so basically, there are a few details that are not entirely like 100% cleared with everyone. I don't think there's some things that contradict each other, but the general situation, as I've come to understand it, is Disney and Sony were sort of renegotiating the Spider-Man deal, like that would allow Disney to have creative control over the Spider-Man movies set within the MCU and all that stuff. And Disney had like propositioned a raise basically for themselves, which would be an increase from 5% of the profits of each of these movies, where Sony would get 95, to a 50-50 split, which is unreasonable and kind of ridiculous for a number of reasons, and predictably, or I guess you could just say sensibly, Sony backed out of the deal. And so where we're at currently, as far as anyone knows, is Sony has decided to back out of the deal because of Disney sort of not being willing to waver on this point. Kevin Feige, the thing that has been like like solidly reported among everything else is that what this means for absolute certain is that Kevin Feige will no longer be credited as executive producer on Spider-Man films, and everyone is just assuming, naturally, of course, that that extends to the character himself no longer being in Kevin Feige's MCU canon. And everyone's looking to point fingers. There's all sorts of different factors going into this, which we'll go into as we talk about this. But I guess I don't know. I guess the most appropriate place to start would be, how did you feel hearing about this for the first time?
Well, yeah. So I was at work and I was off. Well, I was on duty, but it was after working hours. So me and my shipmates were just chilling in our workspace watching John Wick, Chapter 3. And I checked my phone really quick and saw the news for Matrix 4, and I was kind of optimistic about that and hoping it'd be great. And then a good 20 minutes later, I got the news about this deal, and my mood immediately changed, and I was kind of a little bitter the rest of the day.
Yeah.
So this, I'm not going to say it's shocking, but the fact that they're kind of this kind of debacle got out to the public was a bit surprising to me. I figured they would hash all of this out behind closed doors, and we would just get the announcement that they renewed the deal. But apparently not. But yeah, if they don't actually come to an agreement, I'm not a big fan at all. Especially because this will be the second time in a row we've ended the Spider-Man franchise prematurely. And like I said, I do have a significant amount of issues with this version, but I do ultimately like it, and I like that we've gotten to see him interact with characters in the MCU, and I would like to be honest, I would kind of like us to scale back on that and get a little bit away from that and let him just be his own thing in this universe, and we can still reference it and talk about it, but we don't need to keep doing crossovers. We don't need to constantly have him in Iron Man's shadow. I feel like we've finally been able to step out of that by the time we get to the end of Far From Home. So I just wanted to see that continuing, them continue to capitalize on the goodwill they've now gotten with the way that it's served so far in MCU. And if we're going to, like, having read multiple articles and knowing everything that I know both sides, I think if you're going to play the blame game, it rests squarely with Disney.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you on that 100%. So what Disney wanted was not only 50% of the revenue that they would get from any Spider-Man movie, they also wanted 50% controlling interest in the property,
Yeah.
which basically takes away Sony's control over this popular franchise.
Which in turn extends to the Spider-Verse stuff.
And
We know that
every
Sony.
Spider-Man related film that wouldn't be necessarily MCU related. So any sequels to Venom,
Yep.
Craven, Morbius, any future Spider-Verse films, literally every Spider-Man related property that Sony has, Marvel would have creative control over.
Yeah. And see, okay, so I kind of want to hit this point by point, because you actually touched on a lot of interesting stuff. One of them being that, as I mentioned to you before we started this, we are going to talk about the implications of this, both for Disney and Sony, and just like talking about this in real world terms. We're also going to inevitably at some point talk about like where we think within the fiction the character goes from here, how this is going to potentially impact MCU or Sony's plans going forward, that kind of thing. But oh man, you mentioned something specific. Yeah, something that I've personally felt and that I've agreed with since I heard it mentioned by Coy Jandrew on Collider Movie Talk is the whole thing about you being surprised that we even heard about this in the first place. I also am surprised about that. And you've got tons of people, making like conspiracy theories basically at this point, which definitely sound in character for Disney, but have no evidence yet, which is basically like Disney leaked that this whole situation is happening so that they could then use public opinion and sort of like the knee-jerk public backlash against Sony as like a bargaining chip, as hey, let us have what we want, which thankfully people are starting to realize what exactly the situation is, and not dogpiling as much on Sony. But we'll talk more about that. But I don't necessarily believe that's true. That like somebody at Disney decided to make this like a whole operation, like Operation Let's Turn Public Opinion Against Sony one more time. But I agree with what was suggested on Collider Movie Talk, which is just that in the information age, in like the current internet age, we average Joe Schmoes and like wannabe film pundits just know way more than we should about the going ons behind the scenes of these kind of things. Like a couple of years ago, maybe even like a decade or more ago, this kind of thing would happen behind the scenes of a deal between studios or two parties or whatever. We'd never know about it, and like discussion and perception of the movies and stuff would be better for not knowing that. This is the kind of stuff that like we just should not even hear about, because it's just going to lead to a bunch of people freaking out, dogpiling on one party or the other, when it's, like I've been suggesting, probably going to be a non-issue by the time that any real consequences would have been felt.
And the really frustrating part about it for me is a lot of the fear mongering and vitriolic panic that I see from fans online. A lot of it comes from a place of ignorance and not even reading the articles.
Yeah.
They see the headline and they immediately jump to a conclusion. They can't even. No one wants to read anything anymore. We can't even be bothered to click on an article, read through it, and see what is actually being said.
Yeah, and like in part, you're absolutely right that that is a problem of just people who read, or rather don't read, and just consume media and all of these stories. On the other hand, you do have to admit that there is a lot of information to absorb for one person at any given moment, especially on a website like Twitter or Facebook, that's just constantly hitting you in the face with things going on across the world. I do
The
think,
problem is we're not absorbing it. We'll
yeah,
glance at it, immediately forget about it, and move on.
that's true, and that's a problem. But I think contributing to the problem is also the people who make these articles and write these titles. Because, like, if someone's just gonna glance at something, and you, as a person who at this point has worked on the internet for a long time, understand that that's how people work and that's how people are gonna like consume your writing, you should be a little bit more responsible. Like, I kind of want to shake all of the people who like titled their articles "Sony takes Spider-Man out of the MCU." Like, that's not what happened. Like, people,
It's
it's,
not what happened.
yeah, people like title, and I think some of them do it on purpose for like clickbait. And I think maybe some people are just genuinely ignorant to like the nuances of the language they use. And like, I'm an English guy, I was an English major, so I probably obsess over very specific word and grammar choices more than anyone should. But when you
They know
have,
exactly what they're doing, Nick.
yeah,
They're not ignorant to that stuff. It's definitely a clickbait tactic. They know.
yeah, like when you have the situation as it currently exists, as we've sort of laid it out, and you have someone say like anything that kind of alludes to implicitly or otherwise Sony being the active party, like this was Sony's decision. Sony chooses to take Spider-Man out. That's you know how people are going to take that. And I think you as like a news source should be more responsible than that.
Yeah, they care more about clicks than anything else, and their business first. So,
Yeah.
um, as you know,
Which
as
to me is still weird here, because I think no matter how you present this information, it's going to get a lot of eyes on it.
yeah, but yeah. So bring things down from the Disney end, right? You have so the deal as it stood before it ended was they got 5% of the initial box office take, and and that was it. But they were also given all of the merchandising rights,
Yep.
toys, uh, pillowcases, pretty much all that kind of stuff. You know, kind of Spider-Man memorabilia, toys, whatever. Disney had all of it, and they made millions off of it. So that alone, I think, is enough.
And like I've seen people, I'm not gonna name any names, but I've seen people sort of like on YouTube, on Twitter, sort of like make arguments that still seem very ignorant to me. Like, okay, Disney, the under Disney's sort of like creative leadership, the Spider-Man movies are making more money than they did under Sony, which isn't like entirely true. But either
It's
way,
not okay. I'm gonna pull up the numbers right now because I have the numbers, and I also want to speak to that really quick. I already cut you off, Nick.
nah, don't worry about
Um,
it. I was just gonna say that like we've got people making the argument that because Disney has made Spider-Man into a billion-dollar franchise where it wasn't before, Sony should be fine with the 50-50 split because they're still profiting, and that's not how anything works.
no, it's not, and it's so. Besides the fact that they're taking a significant decrease in the amount of revenue that they would get from Spider-Man film, they also don't have full creative control over their major asset, their biggest franchise, and kind of their only franchise now. So if you're any studio, there's no way in hell you're going to agree to that.
Yeah, no. And again, part of this is all based on, and like the people who are getting on Disney's case, rightly so, are also pointing out like Disney already basically has the closest thing to an intellectual monopoly that any studio has ever had before. They really don't need this sort of, because the thing that people don't understand, and that I think maybe a lot of people are willfully ignoring in this situation, is that Marvel is definitely the most publicly sort of known, publicly liked, and most profitable arm of Disney's sort of many tentacled beast at this point. It used to be a couple of decades ago Disney's 2D animated features that was like their main draw. Now you can argue it's the Marvel movies. And what I don't think people realize is that even more so, Spider-Man is that for Sony, where they look at sort of like the way it exists within the fiction and they just look at it like, okay, Spider-Man is just one among many, many Marvel characters. What big difference does it make to Sony if Disney does have controlling interest in that? What they don't realize is that Spider-Man is Sony's big thing. Like he is the big IP that they know that always guarantees a profit for them. And so the risk of losing like control over Spider-Man as an IP puts Sony in way more trouble than say Disney would be in if they were forced to like give up creative control over just Captain America.
Yeah, like that's like putting the hands of like say you have a job, right,
Mm-hmm.
and you have a coworker. That's like putting your promotion and your livelihood in the hands of your coworker,
Yeah,
essentially.
yeah, especially because again, like looking at it in a macro level, Spider-Man is just one Marvel character, and for Disney, they have so many other Marvel characters. For them, it doesn't even look like a big deal. For Sony, he is their guy. That's like that's like people trying to equate like one team losing their star quarterback to another team losing just one of sort of many samey players, all of whom are good, maybe even great, but are kind of interchangeable as far as their
Yeah,
value to the team.
it's not that situation where um you take that one player away and the team is still good. Like you take this player away and they have no team. You
Yeah,
know, like this is all Sony has as in terms of franchises now.
Like it's been
So it's
pointed
one of
out.
the only things keeping them afloat.
Yeah, it's been pointed out that like what does Sony have besides this? It's Jumanji, which no one saw coming, but that's the one thing that they released like recently that was a big hit as far as like the blockbuster scene goes. Everything else, like again, take Spider-Man out of the equation. Their animation isn't doing that hot. Their and Men
And I
in
think their
Black.
biggest hit, I think their biggest hit for Jumanji and Far From Home was Skyfall.
Uh, yeah. I thought you meant like biggest hit like to them, but their biggest like success definitely was Skyfall.
Yeah,
Like Spectre didn't do great, and ironically enough, this Spider-Man news totally overshadowed the announcement of the newest Bond. So who it's still like coin flip up in the air how well that's gonna do.
So I want to just lay out the box office for all the Spider-Man films because a lot of people act like Sony has done nothing but garbage with Spider-Man, and they need Marvel in order to keep going with Spider-Man movies. So
And like
you have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which is the lowest grossing, obviously, because it's an animated film, and in this country in particular, we still adults will never take animation seriously in this country. They'll always view it as just for kids, and that will never change, I think.
that's unfortunate.
So yeah, that's the lowest grossing at 375.5 million. And they have the Amazing Spider-Man 2 at 709,000 million dollars. The first Amazing Spider-Man, 757.9. Spider-Man 2 is 783.8. The first Spider-Man, 821.7. Homecoming, 808 million. Spider-Man 3, 890.9 million. And of course, you now have Far From Home at 1,110 million. Now, if you average all that out, what you end up with is around 790 million. Um, that's very profitable. Every single Spider-Man movie that they've made has been profitable.
Yeah,
They've
and
never
like
had a flop, and they had like Spider-Man 3 outgrossed Homecoming. Like that was also they had no help or influence from Marvel at that time. Um, and Iron Man, the first Iron Man came out just a year after that. Like Marvel Studios didn't even exist at that point. So the the proof is right there. Like they're doing for the first Raimi trilogy, they were doing just fine. 800 million is nothing to sneeze at. Um, so this idea that, I mean, we're declining with the amazing films, most certainly, but this idea that they need Marvel and that they were in trouble on their own, like that studio was in trouble, obviously. But when you look at the gross, it's not like um, BVS where they like severely underperform. You know what I mean?
yeah, no. And like this the one like angle to that where you could argue they maybe have a leg to stand on is if they're not talking about gross and they're just talking about quality. Like Sony need
And even in terms of quality, I like a lot about the first two Raimi films. And
but I just mean in terms of like
Spider-Man, Spider-Man 3 isn't a good movie, but I think it's some of the best Spider-Man action that we've had on screen. I think a lot
yeah,
of that stuff is really well done,
but
and I
like
like the score.
putting aside our individual opinions, I mean like instead of quality, I guess I should say like public perception or like reception where you could say
Everyone, well, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say you could say that there's an argument that maybe they need like the Marvel touch as far as like critical reception because you've got Spider-Verse, which was received incredibly well, like one of the best received superhero movies ever, but that is admittedly a different group of people working on that versus who are working on the live action stuff. And in that field, you've got Venom, which was received kind of all right, like received on a really kind of so bad it's good, like just weird level. People didn't. A lot of critics, especially, generally don't look to Venom as like a good movie. I don't think.
Yeah, it was critically panned, and it was okay-ish for audiences.
Yeah, and like prior to that, you have Amazing 2, which was received really poorly by a lot of people. Received all right by some, but generally not all that great. Amazing 1 really polarizing, Spider-Man 3 really polarizing, and that's over a decade of live action Spider-Man content. So if you want to make that argument that like in terms of just having critics and audiences on kind of like a united front as far as how much they'll praise the movie and stuff, then sure, I guess Sony quote unquote needs Disney Marvel on that level. And you could like because no one can tell the future. We don't know if like if they'd continued down the track of like if they kept releasing Amazing Spider-Man 2 and Venom level stuff without the uh without the MCU uh things going on concurrently, who knows how that might potentially have damaged the brand and that might have cost them some money down the road, but again, we can't know that.
Uh, I just feel like, well, the first two Spider-Man films were very well received, and then Spider-Man 3 came out, and everyone pretended that's the only Spider-Man movie we ever got, and
I don't think anyone pretended that, but okay.
you know what I mean. Every time someone brings up the Raimi films, Tobey Maguire, it's always Spider-Man 3. It's always that ridiculous scene of him walking down the street and pointing at girls and doing the dumb dance. Like that's all anyone has to say about the Raimi.
That's one of those things that I thankfully think is pretty self-contained to like certain very specific groups online and stuff. I don't think that applies to general audiences.
I don't know. And then with the Andrew Garfield films, a lot of people were against that just because it was a reboot, and like it didn't matter how good that movie was. They weren't gonna like it because it wasn't Tom Maguire, and people are remakes and reboots, and they're never justified or whatever. So I think a lot of the hatred and dismissal of the first Amazing film is completely unwarranted, and I honestly cannot defend that second movie. Um, Despite my love for Andrew Garfield's performance and how well I think a lot of that movie is executed, sometimes visually, for the most part, it is a very, very bad movie. And
Yeah, and so you've got people who don't want to go back to that. And that's, I think, a fair enough fear to have, but I think at some point we gotta, like, as much as it might pain me to say this, we gotta put the quality or like how we subjectively perceive the quality of the movies aside for a little bit and just like admit that Disney doing this, regardless of what the potential outcome might be far down the line, was just not a kosher thing to do. And I want to kind of pivot since we've talked a little bit about how we think Sony may or may not be like financially impacted if they were to just take the character back. I also think that for as much as this situation currently is a lose 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 for everyone, if it stays the way it is, it's a lose for Disney, it's a lose for Sony, it's a lose for the fans. I think Disney and the MCU as a whole, I don't think is going to be very impacted by this at all, assuming it goes forward. Because you've
not
got,
even a little bit.
yeah, like on the one hand, and I've been meaning to say this actually, in like on the channel, is just that I like the one kind of silver lining that admittedly is a very, very thin silver lining that I see if this deal like actually goes through and Spidey is like from here on out not in the MCU period anymore, is that the MCU and Disney by extension is such a massive, seemingly invincible machine at this point that it's kind of oddly satisfying to see them take a dent in anything. And like this again ties into the comparisons that people make with the James Gunn situation. Again, very different, and yet it does kind of carry that vibe of like, if this happens and this isn't fixed, this is the most tangible quote unquote loss that the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a franchise will have suffered maybe ever. And it's kind of comforting to know that that can still happen.
Uh, I guess. Um,
Again, like I said, very,
I've been
very
dreading this day ever since we got the announcement that they were making this deal in the first place.
I don't know. It's just like I
Like
again.
because in the back of my mind, like part of me always thought they would get to this place where it's like, okay, you helped us pick ourselves up off the ground. We're good to sever ties and just can continue doing our own thing.
Yeah, like
I think that is still very much a possibility, just as much as it is a possibility that they reach an arrangement and move forward as they were. Or not
mhm,
necessarily as they were, maybe they have to fork out more money to Disney, but in that we keep getting MCU Spider-Man films.
yeah, but like, don't get me wrong. I'm not happy to see Spider-Man leave the MCU. I'm suggesting more that I'm happy that like, okay, these movies are basically just like a printing press that make we've now had a couple billion-dollar movies in a row, and it's almost uncanny that any one movie franchise has as much like cultural and or monetary power that this one does, and tying that into Disney being this huge almost monopolistic corporate conglomerate, and this being a big part of what got them to that place. Just seeing the MCU like on any level sort of lose anything tangible that isn't just some people don't like the movies as much as others, it should be a bit of a wake up call, I think.
Well, I think this has, again, less to do with Marvel proper and more to do with Disney.
Yeah, of course.
People have
Like,
been talking about this deal like Marvel and Disney are exactly the same thing, and they're really not.
yeah, no, I'm not suggesting that. It's just that obviously, no matter what happens, Marvel is going to be impacted. So,
If you think, like, I think personally that if Kevin Feige had his way, the deal would have gone through without a hitch. Um, he's not really concerned about the money because, again, they started off the deal only getting 5% of opening weekend gross. That's it. And Disney got merchandising.
yeah.
And that they didn't have to fork out a dime on any of the Spider-Man or any of the Marvel films that Spider-Man appeared in. Captain America: Civil War, Avengers: Infinity War, Avengers: Endgame. Disney didn't have to give Sony a dime for his appearances in those films.
Yeah. Although to be fair, like I say, Marvel will be impacted, and although that's probably not right. Like we already agree, as has earlier been stated, like just like Sony will more than likely be just fine on their own, monetarily, if not critically, taking the character back. The MCU, like whatever plans they have for the future, like near or far future, I think a lot of people don't want to admit it, but I think are going to be just fine without Spider-Man.
Absolutely, especially because Spider-Man is not a cosmic character,
Mm-hmm.
and you don't need him for any of those stories. You honestly didn't even necessarily need him for uh, Endgame. And the only reason I think, well, I mean, it's fun to have him in action scenes and stuff, but I think the biggest reason he's in Infinity War is how emotionally impactful his death scene with Tony is.
Yeah, and like because the thing is, outside of his relationship with Tony, who is a character who is now dead, his role in any of the crossovers has been very much sort of negligible from a story perspective.
Pretty much.
And like I don't have a problem with that. Like I'm not saying that that's an issue with Civil War, with Infinity War, with Endgame, but I think maybe because part of this, and we're going to talk about obviously where we left off with Far From Home, I've got a couple of people who maybe think that because we ended on such a big twist, like everyone knows who Peter Parker is, that he's Spider-Man, like that is going to lead to some whatever's next for him is going to be more like wide spanning. I don't necessarily believe that's true. And like I don't think whatever happened with Spider-Man after Far From Home was ever going to leave the confines of his next movie. So either way, and like I'm
Yeah,
of the
that's such a personal issue for him, and no other heroes really have that issue.
yeah, and like either way, I think it's possible that Sony could continue that story on their own. It would be very difficult, but we know that Holland is signed on for one more movie, and that contract is with Sony. So I don't know. I hear sometimes I hear one movie, sometimes I hear Holland has two more movies. But as far as we know, Sony could conceivably take Holland and potentially also the rest of his cast as they exist, like not counting any characters who were in the MCU prior to his movies,
Which is
and
Happy.
just
And I kind of have a big issue with
Happy,
that. I think Happy should be in that movie. Um,
agreed, Happy and Fury slash Talos if they wanted to bring him back, which I doubt they would anyway.
yeah.
And I think that might be it. They wouldn't be able to mention the snap or the blip, and that would potentially be a little bit of a difficult workaround, but I could see it happening. Either way, I think it's perfectly conceivable that Sony just picks up where the MCU left off, and the MCU just doesn't acknowledge it, and functionally it's the same as what we would have gotten anyway.
And funny enough that I got this news while rewatching John Wick Chapter 3. Not saying that I'm going to hate the movie if they don't do exactly what I want, but I think it's a colossal missed opportunity if they don't do this. Do it like John Wick. Pick up the second after Mysterio drops that bombshell.
Yep, that was my plan. Like, like I feel like that's the natural way that you would go with that.
Don't do some dumb, cheap time skip. Um, because another big issue that I had with this incarnation of Spider-Man, the ending of his first film reads as literally just a joke. And it was funny and it was fine, but it seems like they're not interested in any of the pathos with his supporting cast, with the kind of minimalistic exception of Mary Jane. Um, we're playing Aunt May just for comedy. I do not like that.
Which is weird because that's not necessarily true in Homecoming. And like again, we've already been going on for a little while, and I'm not saying that we have to wrap this up anytime soon, but I don't want to get sidetracked onto talking about opinions about individual movies because that doesn't really
Well, no,
pertain.
I'm just trying to illustrate my point here in regards to the ending of Far From Home.
Oh, well, my only counter argument was just going to be I agree. Aunt May is like probably my least favorite thing in Far From Home, but just within Homecoming, she's not only a joke. Like,
What I'm saying is, we played that big moment of like her finding out who he is as a joke, which is fine. It's not the Last Jedi thing where that's supposed to be a big like dramatic moment, and then we play it for comedy in the very next movie. It's not that. At the same time, though, I did want their relationship like explored. Of like, okay, some time has passed. He's gone through some major stuff. She's okay with him being a superhero and risking his life. We don't need a flashback scene. They can like in context of now, like just go over why she's okay with him doing what he does. I think that scene should definitely be in the movie.
Yeah, and by that same token, although I am advocating for like starting the next movie immediately after Far From Home picks up, you don't necessarily need to do that, and just like doing a time skip and playing the ending of Far From Home as a joke are not the same thing. Like you can do a time skip, but it's not like a massive time skip. It can be like a couple of months wherein Peter is still like not in a good situation and the conflict hasn't like really resolved. Just you can do a time skip, just don't resolve the issue off screen. That would be ridiculously wasteful.
Yeah, and on the creative end, I really hope that they have a plan for that. Because I sent you that message right after we started recording.
Yeah, if you want to get
Part of
into
me
that,
is yeah, part of me is really, really worried about how they're going to handle that movie because, as I said, in the Civil War comic book storyline, Spider-Man reveals his identity purposefully, and it has some pretty serious ramifications in that Aunt May gets shot. But then we don't really know how to keep telling Spider-Man stories in that status quo, so we quickly retcon it, much in the same way that when Frank Miller took away the lawyer thing from Matt Murdock, when Kingpin destroyed his life and took away his ability to practice law, none of the new writers coming on to that book knew what to do with Daredevil if he's not a lawyer. And it kind of um, brought the question, well, begs the question, is Daredevil even Daredevil if he's not a lawyer? And to the same token, in this context, is Spider-Man even Spider-Man if he no longer has a secret identity? How do you keep telling stories with him moving forward? And that's something that we never even figured out in the comics. So I'd be blown away if they were able to pull that off on film.
like the only way they could conceivably do it, right, is by somehow in a way that would probably feel pretty contrived, and I say this from experience, like thinking about how to do that, like somehow convince the public that like the report was wrong and that Jameson slash Mysterio just isn't reliable and that he's not Spider-Man, which I mean you could do, but you'd have to be real careful to make people buy it.
Yeah, and they get away with it okay in the Spectacular Spider-Man cartoon when Venom tries to out him.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a significantly different situation.
And
There's
although
no
again, that would also be a reason why you wouldn't want to do a time skip, right? Because the more time that passes in story where people just take it as a given that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, the less believable it is that you could like reverse that. Like
my
if the
point
next
exactly.
yeah, like if the next movie is like the day that happens or the day after or a week after even, then I could see people believing like, all right, I can salvage this. I can convince people that Mysterio was just lying. So, like, yeah, that's another reason among many why you wouldn't want to do the time skip thing.
And another big kind of concern that I have with that ending is we just put MJ and this Peter Parker together finally,
Mhm.
and I don't see how you can conceivably have a movie where we get to see them just dating and being happy together as a couple when you have Spider-Man, who's I imagine going to have to be on the run to some degree because not only does everyone like know who he is now, but Mysterio made him out to be a terrorist.
Yeah. Although I don't know, I do think there is kind of something like inherently Spider-Man-y about the idea that they would have to sort of like steal away any moments they got together in secret.
That's
Although
true.
Although
But
that brings me to another point, which is just because we both know way too much and way too little information about what's actually going on, let's assume that I'm partially wrong about what I said earlier, and like Sony is able to use Tom Holland going forward, but not any of his supporting cast because they're technically, like, air quotes, MCU creations. Like, how do we know for sure that Sony doesn't just make another Tom Holland movie that doesn't have Zendaya in it or doesn't have Jacob Batalon in it, and there's no explanation for that?
oh, that would be awful.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't put it past them to do that because I think no matter how this deal goes, they're going to continue using Tom Holland. That's the one thing they will keep and will not let go of
Yeah.
because they
Although, I
kind of
mean,
have to. Even if they end up quote unquote rebooting, they're going to keep Tom Holland in that role.
although I should have said this at the beginning, and like now I do think maybe we should wrap up unless you have a lot of other things to say. I should have mentioned this at the beginning, like them using Tom Holland, the idea that I'm still sticking by that this deal will be fixed eventually, all of this kind of conjecture that we're doing relies on us having a lot of faith in both parties when the fact that we are in this situation in the first place suggests that one or both of them is way less, like, handling this property way less intelligently than we would give them credit for. Like, the idea that of course Sony will keep Tom Holland, like, of course they would, it just makes sense. Sony has done a lot of things in the past that don't make sense with this character, and Disney is currently doing something that doesn't make sense at all with the whole asking for 50% thing. And
I, I, I
I
would
should
argue that a lot of the quote unquote bad decisions Sony made with this character come less from stuff that we've actually seen and more from those leaked emails that got out.
true.
The Aunt May movie, the the Black Cat Silver Sable thing.
I
Um,
mean, hey, Morbius is still getting made, so
my point is though that whole they've done a lot of really bad decisions with this character. Where the hell does that even come from? Like Amazing Spider-Man 2 was bad, yeah, but people are
I'm
talking like they've had like this laundry list of awful things that they've done with the character, and I'm like,
I'm
no, that's
I'm
not real. Nothing that actually got made and got solidified. Like I don't know what you guys are talking about.
I'm not even gonna say necessarily bad decisions, like decisions that have consequences, but like I just mean like counterintuitive decisions almost. Like, it ended in a movie that I thought was really good, but the decision to reboot as quickly as they did coming off of the Raimi trilogy, like not even waiting the full 4 years,
They
and then
had no choice to. They waited any longer than that, and the rights would have reverted straight back to Marvel. So
that's
I
true.
don't. That's not really a decision. That their hand was forced. Like they
That's
either make that movie or the rights are taken away from them.
that's fair. I think it's easy for some people to forget that. But like, okay, another, like, the big one that comes to my mind is just forcing Venom into Spider-Man 3. Like, you've got like the first two movies, which especially at the time were beloved, and it's all because of Sam Raimi's vision. And then for the third one, you're gonna be like, hey, put in this major antagonist that you don't want in your movie.
Yeah, there was no way that was going to blow over well.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, you're right. They don't exactly have like as bad of a track record as people pretend they do as far as things that actually solidified. Like, as far as just like stuff that never got off the ground floor but was being considered, they have a lot of wacky decisions. But I don't know. Like, the fact that we're in this situation in the first place, like, the thing that we want to happen is that cooler heads prevail. But I'm not sure how, like,
Likely that is.
not even likely. I'm not sure, like, how, like, heads that were so uncool being in charge let us get here in the first place, especially because, and this is the one big piece of information that I kind of didn't put into the whole general synopsis of the situation just because I don't know how true this is, but the suggestion that Disney at some point did say, okay, we'll scale back from 50% and go down to 30, or either Disney scaled back or Sony offered them 30%, and Disney or Sony, it's unclear who, still refused to take that side of the deal. If Sony is the one who said no to 30% coming down from 50, that's maybe still understandable, but less so, I think.
Okay, I have a rebuttal to that, and I've mentioned that rebuttal a lot online. So here's the reason why it's like the whole 30% thing is still pretty big, and why I don't think Sony is in the wrong at all for refusing even that. Because so let's say they implemented that deal before Far From Home came out, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's now a $1 billion movie. But if they had to relinquish 30% of that to Disney, what they end up with is a $700 million movie, which puts them in the same range of the two amazing films. Why would they settle for that when all three of the Raimi films made more than that in the $800 million range, and so did Homecoming?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And like the big thing that I want to end out on, and just to preface this, I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with Disney asking for an increase, period. It just has to be reasonable because, like, if the idea is, okay, we entered this deal with 5% because neither party was 100% sure that it was going to work out, but across two Spider-Man movies, Disney has proven that they can like get the character critically well liked, that they can have the character appearing consistently in really well received movies and turn him into a $1 billion franchise. And they're like, okay, we've proven that our utility to you, Sony, is worthy of more than 5%, that's fine. But it has to be reasonable. Like, increase from 5% to 10% or 15 or maybe even 20 at the highest, but like 30 or 50 is, especially 50, and like again going into like, is the real thing just that they want the IP control? That's just ridiculous. And the big takeaway from this whole situation, I think, should be, because everyone going into this deal, like since it was announced, like back in 2015, everyone, myself included, was kind of looking at Sony as the big question mark. As like, if this goes south for any reason, it'll be because of Sony. Everyone, I think, just kind of took it for granted that Disney would be satisfied with having the character and getting a small cut because they've got so much other stuff. The character basically guarantees more seats for their movies, that sort of thing. The big lesson that I think everyone should take away from this having happened is just how like never satisfied Disney will be, like just how really greedy Disney is fundamentally, and that
Especially because this was their year. Like they're the first studio in history to have $5 billion pictures in one year, and the year isn't even over yet. I believe we still have Frozen 2 and the next Star Wars film coming out.
yeah. And like those, I would be surprised if, like, I know people are gonna say, "Oh, Star Wars is gonna take a hit because of Last Jedi and like Solo or whatever." I'm still gonna be pretty shocked if Star Wars doesn't at least make like within the 850-900 million range, if not a 1 billion.
I
I
wouldn't be surprised if that new Star Wars movie cracks $1 billion.
Yeah, I
Just
wouldn't
because
at all.
you have a lot of, I mean, the fan base is very split right now. But the thing that I think um people like us that run in our circles forget when they see a lot of like vitriolic hatred and constant movie bashing online. Those same people trashing on the movie will definitely see it open weekend just so they can trash the next one.
Yeah. And also, what a lot of people also forget, which I bring up whenever I can, is that those people, no matter how vocal or how like pervasive they seem in online circles, are not where the vast majority of the money comes from anyway.
They're not.
The vast majority of the money for all of these movies comes from average Joe Schmo moviegoers who do not frequent YouTube or Twitter or whatever, who like do not feel strongly enough about any given movie to voice their opinion online like that. Like it comes from people who are just going to go, "Oh, a new Star Wars movie? Cool," and just sit down for a new like popcorn flick.
Yeah, and I think no matter what happens with this deal, the next Spider-Man movie that Sony makes will certainly make money.
Yeah.
We haven't had a Spider-Man movie flop, regardless of its quality, and that's I mean that speaks to the quality of not the quality, that speaks to the popularity and love that people have for the character. Like it is kind of hard, given that we've had two significantly bad Spider-Man films. It is pretty impressive that both of those made their money back fairly easily.
Yeah. But yeah, that okay, so I really didn't want to bring this up and like we may just end it here, but do you want to talk about the Stanley thing?
All I saw was the headline. I didn't get around to actually reading that article, but I know that his daughter apparently sided with Sony. Is that correct?
His daughter sided with Sony and like very, very vocally like condemned Disney not just for this situation, but just how they treated Stan in general. And I don't think anyone knows enough about that to say whether she's correct or not. But the main reason that I bring it up is because if anything that's happened in the past couple of days, like really, really negatively affects like perception of Disney and Disney's part to play in this whole thing, and possibly even has long term consequences for the MCU, it's going to be that. It's going to be Stanley's daughter, like, coming out and saying, "Oh no, Disney did not treat my father well at all. They kind of just used him like a tool."
And my question for that would be, why is like the cancellation of this deal the impetus for her finally coming out and speaking up about that? I guess it's because it's his most popular character,
Yeah,
and
she did mention, like, she felt that I forget what the exact word she used was. It wasn't abuse, but something to the effect of like Disney has abused my father's creations, something like that, or disrespected, something to that effect.
is it just because she perceives those new movies as Iron Man Jr. or
I don't think it even is relegated just to Spider-Man. Like, hang on, I'm actually going to pull up the quote
okay?
because I don't. I was unsure if I even wanted to talk about this, but I just think it's I think it's especially since it's initially reported by TMZ, and I don't respect them hardly at all. But it is a direct quote, and just I think again the Disney machine is so big that I could be wrong, and this will end up feeling like nothing at all, and it'll hardly dent them.
It kind of felt like nothing to me when I looked at the article. Honestly, um,
Yeah,
like I don't think honestly I don't think you could tarnish Disney at this point. I think it would take like one of their big execs going down for sexual harassment or abuse or something.
yeah, and even then, like that is negatively going to affect them from a company perspective. I don't know about the movies. I think
Oh,
we're
the movies,
still
no, most certainly.
I still think we're very much in a place where, like, as movies, the Marvel films are basically impenetrable until they have like two or three really poorly received ones in a row. But what she said was Marvel and Disney seeking total control of my father's creations must be checked and balanced by others who, while still seeking the profit, have genuine respect for Stanley and his legacy. Whether it's Sony or someone else's, the continued evolution of Stan's characters and his legacy deserves multiple points of view. When my father died, no one from Marvel or Disney reached out to me. From day one, they have commoditized my father's work and never shown him or his legacy any respect or decency. In the end, No one could have treated my father worse than Marvel and Disney executives.
Wow.
Yeah. So like that's a lot. So if any part of this, and I'm not saying it will, but if any part of this situation like hurts Disney or the MCU going forward, it's going to be stuff like that. Just because Stan was so baked into, like, again, they've got a lot of things going on. I'm not saying any one reason is the cause for like why the MCU is as successful and profitable and well liked as it is, but Stan was a big part of like how they engaged with fans and like the sort of optics of Stan Lee as part of that franchise were very much a big part in like comics fans, and it was endearing. It was a big endearing thing, kind of like, it's Uncle Stan, like Uncle Walt was for Disney before him. And now if you have like his blood relations saying like no one could have treated my dad worse than Disney, that's going to have some blowback, assuming it doesn't get completely swept under the rug.
Um, like that, hearing those words from her, kind of makes my blood boil. And I believe that on the Disney end. I think Marvel, like Marvel proper, actually had all the love and respect in the world for Stan, and seeing all the bonds I've seen for those movies and his cameos and everything, and always like not even there'd be days where he just come on set and like just watch them make the movies and not even cameo. But I think it's more a Disney thing, and that we're just going to use this guy to make ourselves money, and he's a commodity.
Yeah, and like keep in mind the real big reason I didn't want to bring this up, and yet now that we're talking about it, I would feel kind of irresponsible if I didn't mention, is the camp of people who are choosing not to believe her or take her words with a grain of salt because it's not 100% confirmed whether or not she herself had sort of like an abusive relationship with Stan, whether or not she kind of like mistreated him in certain ways, and there's a whole like discussion about to what even was their relationship, and I don't feel comfortable talking about that, but it's come up in the discussion, and it's something to consider when like talking about just this being her own words.
Okay. Well, I know you're not comfortable talking about that, but I wonder where that comes from because I
Ah,
don't.
I'll message you what I know about it when we're done here because I don't want to talk about it on the channel.
Okay, of course, sure. So I think that this news is unfortunate, but there's every possibility that it gets rectified in the future. Um,
Yeah, I'm even gonna go as far ahead and say likelihood. Like it's not gonna happen overnight, most likely, but like it's good. I'm gonna bet like right now, within a few months, within a year, this is going to be like a speed bump in the road. I could be wrong, but I don't think I am.
yeah, okay. I think we more or less tackled everything. I was not expecting us to go this long.
Yeah, me neither. This always kind of happens where we go on for a while, but it feels to me like it's flying by. I just want to reiterate again, I think the most important thing to come out of this is just we all have to be more wary of Disney and like what their motives are, because any other studio, I feel like any other person as proxy for Disney would have been satisfied with the deal as they had it. But Disney just does not have any intentions or like any plans of when to stop consuming everything. And I think we all have to be very careful of that. And that is the most important lesson of this whole thing.
Yeah, I think like they're not willing. Well, in the event that they're not willing to budge on this deal, they would just wait and try to buy Sony later. But um, Sony has to want to be bought, and I don't think they do.
I don't even like. I don't even want to entertain that just because Sony just straight up being bought doesn't even feel to me like it's on the table. Like I know that sounds a little bit silly to say after they did in fact buy Fox, but Fox, like you said, was looking to sell off to somebody.
Yeah,
Assuming Sony doesn't want to, the cost that it would take to buy them out is more than I think even Disney would be comfortable spending. So it's not even worth entertaining, I don't think.
yeah, I think you're probably right on that. Well, guys, please leave your comments down below. Let us know what you think of this deal potentially being put on indefinite hold or straight up canceled, or do you agree with us that you think that by the end of the year this will have probably been a very moot point?
Yeah, and do you maybe disagree with us that Sony and or the MCU will be able to just keep on trucking business as usual if the deal doesn't get fixed?
And I'm not like I we both made our opinions known that we feel like if you have to point a finger in like and if you have at all an informed opinion, I think it the blame should rest with Disney.
Hmm.
But if you have a like any legitimate reasoning as to why you feel differently, feel free to share that as well.
And so, yeah, that's about it. StreamYard works brilliantly, and so we're just going to be using this in place of Google Hangouts now for the foreseeable future, which means you should be seeing more live stream content here on the channel as it's, live, obviously. But thank you for listening in, and we'll see you guys later.
All right, guys.